The ACC has been wildly disrespected by the college football playoff, the committee members, the rankers, and it's time I come to their defense. I come to our defense in ACC country.
Plant the flag.
Gotta do it. By the way, I don't know if everybody heard that. Dennis planted his fist on the table in defiance. Plant the flag. I like it. The committee released their first college football playoff rankings of the year, and one conference is not being treated the same as the other conferences. One conference is not being given the respect despite the numbers saying they should, despite the narrative saying they should, despite the storyline saying they should. The committee put Ohio State at number 1 over Georgia and Michigan at 2 and 3. Florida State at number 2. Florida State's being disrespected, and they're being blamed for the ACC not being, from a narrative perspective, as good as the other conferences, the SEC and the Big Ten. Well, let me dive in. Okay, let's have fun with this one, because you may say, well, of course the ACC is being seen as worse. They only have 2 teams in the top 25 of the rankings. Well, that's interesting. You would bring that up, because there are only 4 teams in the country that are not in the college football playoff top 25, yet have only 2 losses, and they're in the Power 5. So there's only 4 Power 5 teams in the country with just 2 losses that aren't in the top 25 of these rankings. The 4 teams are Rutgers, who from the eye test objectively stinks, Iowa, who just announced they're going to move on from their offensive coordinator, who happens to be the head coach's son, so things are going well there. Then North Carolina and Miami. Then North Carolina and Miami. 2 teams who have their problems. They have their flaws, don't get me wrong. Bad losses, absolutely. I've been very tough on North Carolina the past 2 days. I've been very tough on Miami over the last 2 weeks. Like, we can have those conversations, but you can find reasons to be upset with every 2-loss team. They have 2 losses. Why are only the ACC's 2-loss teams being so negatively thought of? And then because the ACC is seen as this lesser, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? If you keep out the ACC's 2-loss teams from the top 25, then you say, oh, the ACC isn't as good. They only have 2 teams in the top 25. Then you look at Florida State and go, well, of course they have to be below Georgia and Michigan. Why? Because they play in the bad ACC. Why do we think they play in the bad ACC? Because they have only 2 ranked teams. Why do they only have 2 ranked teams? Because you just chose not to put the 2-loss teams in the top 25. It was a choice. And then you look at the reasons that Ohio State jumped over Georgia and Michigan. Ohio State is number 1. Georgia and Michigan are number 2 and number 3. Why is Ohio State the best out of the bunch? Here's Boo Corrigan, NC State's athletic director, who's a part of the committee.
The win over Penn State, the win at Notre Dame, the win at Wisconsin, a top 5 defense, looking at who they are, what they've done this year. Georgia with the big win over Florida, the win over Kentucky, when you're weighing these things out, and you know this, I mean, everything's thin. It's not wide gaps that we're talking about and that we're looking at. So, at the end of it, the 13 members of the committee came up with Ohio State won based on, kind of the resume to date and the way they play and what they've been able to accomplish this year. Georgia, really, really good team, but we put Ohio State 1 and Georgia 2.
I like that logic. I like the logic of putting Ohio State above Georgia and Michigan. I like looking at their wins and saying you've beaten better teams, so you get to be number 1, even if you haven't looked as dominant. Right? There are games that Ohio State has won that came down to the wire. They didn't blow teams out, but they've won all of their games, and their strength of schedule, the opponents they've played, has been more impressive. Well, guess what? Florida State has better wins. Florida State has more impressive wins than Georgia and Michigan. I don't know why that same logic only applies to Ohio State and not Florida State, other than nobody likes the ACC. Why doesn't the same logic apply to Florida State? Florida State has a win over number 14 LSU by 21 points. Talk about the way they play. The way they play destroyed a top 15 team in the country. The SP Plus, right? The ranking, the statistical rankings that matter, have top 30 rankings for both Duke and Clemson. Florida State beat them both. This is a legitimate gripe. And by the way, you could not find a more, you may say like, oh, you're an ACC fan, so you're just defending the ACC. Let me be clear on something. All offseason, I was called a hater of Florida State. We've got the YouTube comments and the Twitter comments to prove it. Florida State fans don't like me.
That's true. They don't.
So I'm sitting here saying Florida State deserves to be number 2 in the college football playoff rankings. I think I carry a little bit of objectivity there. Why doesn't the same logic that applied to Ohio State apply to Florida State, other than the Big Ten just inherently gets the benefit of every doubt while the ACC inherently doesn't? And this isn't like a reputation going back years and years thing. The college football playoff ranking is a ranking of this year. If it went back years and years and years, guess what? Georgia's over Ohio State because Georgia hasn't lost a game in a long time. Georgia is the 2-time defending national champion. So if you're saying like it's a reputation, it's a history thing, then Georgia's number 1. By putting Ohio State over Georgia and Michigan, what you are saying is undefeated's the most important part, and then you look at who you beat is the second most important part. Unless you're an ACC team. I guess that's it, right? So the most important part is undefeated. The second most important part, are you not in the ACC? The third most important part is who did you play? And that's messed up. And that, that's not the ACC's fault, by the way.
No, it's not.
How the college football playoff looks at you and just artificially and very subjectively says you're not worthy, that is not the ACC's fault. But guess who's going to blame the ACC? Florida State, Clemson, UNC, all the schools that are voting against expansion and voting against making it as strong as possible for the future because they might want to leave one day. They're looking at it and saying, hey, if we did exactly what we're doing, if Florida State did exactly what they're doing and they happen to do it in another conference, they're the number 1 team in the country. But because they did it in the ACC, they're the number 4 team in the country. And without a super difficult schedule the rest of the way, they might get jumped if an Oregon or a Washington remain undefeated from this point forward. Now you're outside the college football playoff despite doing everything you should have done, and you should have been the number 2 team when the first rankings came out. By the way, I'm fine with putting them behind Ohio State because I like Ohio State's wins better. Penn State, Notre Dame, those are real.
They are real, even though Penn State really hasn't played anybody other than Ohio State this whole season.
Again, subjective. Like I'm cool with that because they have some bona fides.
Yeah.
Look at it. I challenge you to go look at Georgia and Michigan's schedule thus far. They will be tested, but they haven't been yet.